next presenter is Alexandra Tunstall. She is a professor of art history at Savannah College of Art, and she's going to be talking to us about Imperial China, specifically the Ming and Qing dynasties in the 14th and 17th centuries. Dynasties which she's going to unravel for us as she looks at Imperial China. And in particular, it's kesi. Am I pronouncing it right? Kesi?
It's kesi. It's hard to say.
Sorry, I have the wrong accent. But thank you, Alexandra. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for having me. Let me share my screen, make sure I'm on top of things. All right, so my paper is called The Technology of Imitation, Silk Tapestry Weave in Imperial China. So the technology of tapestry weave was imported to China from Central Asia, called kesi, or weft woven silk. This technique was first used for clothing and sutra wrappers. However, the weave was soon used to produce patterned textiles, and then in the 12th century was used to reproduce the visual language of painting, for example, over here on the right. In this talk, I'll give a brief introduction to the origins of tapestry weave in China. I will explore briefly how tapestry weave has been used throughout imperial Chinese material culture, from clothing items to furnishings. Lastly, I'll focus on the area of my expertise, which is the tapestry woven works that reproduce the visual language of painting and calligraphy. I'll examine the weaving techniques used to create the visual appearance of color blending and texture in a tapestry weave. And because it turns out there's a standardization of such techniques, we're able to view a visual vocabulary created by tapestry weavers in China, evidence that does not exist in historical texts, but rather the objects themselves. All right, so kesi is usually translated in English as tapestry weave. The term is used exclusively for Chinese tapestry woven in silk. And it utilizes blocks of colored threads with discontinuous wefts to create clearly defined shapes. Romanized as Kesi, so often mispronounced, the Chinese characters used to write this term have actually changed throughout history, and sometimes at the whim of writers. In modern Chinese, these characters, kesi, are the preferred usage, and they translate as weft woven and silk. All right, so in the current practice of Chinese tapestry weaving, a modern horizontal or upright loom is used. And I'm gonna base my description of weaving techniques and processes on historical textual sources, the most important of which was written in the 12th century by Zhuangchuo, dated to 1133, and then contemporary practices as well. And I was fortunate enough, when I was in Suzhou at the Embroidery Institute, I was fortunate enough to meet a master weaver, Mr. Li Ronggen, who talked with me about his weaving practices. So here's a quick overview of Chinese tapestry weave on silk. Once the preliminary design and shape and size are decided upon, the horizontal treadle loom is strung with warp threads. And in Chinese tapestry weaving, the warp threads, these are the threads under tension, and this is an old exhibit, so there's not a lot of tension left here. The warp threads are almost always unboiled, undyed silk that are twisted to increase their strength and elasticity. And you can actually see this in this Ming Dynasty tapestry weave in an area where the weft is damaged. Once the warps are threaded onto the loom, the design or composition is sketched onto them with brush and ink. And then the weft threads are woven between the warp threads. I know we have weavers here who know all about this, but I know some of my students aren't as familiar. In tapestry weave, the most basic weave, called tabby or plain weave, one weft thread, or those usually that run horizontal, that goes over a warp, under the next, over, under, and then the next thread, under, over, etc. However, in tapestry weave, the dyed weft threads, the colored threads, are beaten down, right? They're packed down tightly, hiding the undyed warp threads. Therefore, tapestry weave is called a weft-faced plain weave. All right, and once a specific color is no longer needed, the thread is cut. The end is left loose, as you can see here, or tucked under another thread, and then another color weft is introduced. This creates clear boundaries between colors and sometimes a slit in the surface of the fabric. All right, unlike a lot of weaves where a supplemental weft might run along the back of the fabric, kesi is completely reversible and depends upon each color and each thread for the integrity of the textile. All right. The earliest examples of Chinese tapestry weave pictured here date to the 7th century during China's Tang dynasty. And they are thin, 1 centimeter thick belts discovered on tomb figurines. So these two belts, one depicted on a tomb figurine and the other one laid out so we can see it, both come from the same area, from Turfan, the Northwest in today's China. They date almost to the same year, the 680s, and they're remarkably similar in design. In terms of archaeological evidence, weft-faced textiles are not native to China. They were imported from Central Asia. So once the technology was embraced by Chinese weavers, then tapestry weave was used for many more purposes than these small bands on tomb figurines. However, a lot of scholars like to look at this as the very beginnings of kesi, of silk tapestry weave in China. And I do want to remind everyone that even though these are tiny, little 1 centimeter bands, they're rather simple, only a few warps and a simple pattern in the weft. We should remember that these belts are part of a larger outfit made for these tomb figurines. And this outfit is very sophisticated. This is probably not the very beginnings of kesi. You can see you have this tiny little belt. You have this wonderful warp-faced weave with its pearl roundels, which is actually a pattern imported from Central Asia as well. And we saw an example in an earlier presentation, right? Maximilian Durand's presentation this morning. And then the skirt is striped figured silk with an overlay of gauze. And then there's resist dye on her shawl. This is all for a small 29 centimeter figurine. And in fact, these pearl roundel patterned silks were made in China at the time. And this is the pattern made in miniature for figurines. So we can see the sophistication of this outfit, and likely as more archaeological finds come to light, we're gonna find more evidence of earlier kesi, of earlier tapestry weave in China. All right, so to continue our kind of timeline of tapestry weave kesi was used to make clothing items and functional items throughout Chinese history. Here's a hat woven with some golden threads from the 10th century. We find a lot of utilitarian objects, boots, hats, and small pouches made of tapestry weave. It's in the 12th century that we begin to see kesi used as wrappers for hand scrolls. So patterned weaves like these two beautiful patterns with birds and flowers were wrapped around and mounted on the outside of hand scrolls, adding a decorative and beautiful exterior to the object as a reflection of the precious interior, the painting. And here are a few kind of scrolls with modern mounting. So this still happens. You can see these beautiful brocades are used as this kind of exterior layer of hand scrolls. So we see works like this purple ground kesi in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that was actually mounted on this very painting, this Northern Song landscape painting by the famous painter Guo Xi. Now this tapestry weave has been removed from the exterior of the scroll and preserved as a work of art in its own right. All right. So around the same time we see these scroll wrappers being used, we start to see tapestry weave being used to create images that look like paintings. So using the visual language of painting to, visual language of painting to, in tapestry weave. All right, so as Chinese weavers begin to use tapestry weave to reproduce pictorial compositions, they change the way colors and the transitions between them are treated. Previously, patterned textiles were produced using kesi, for example, right, our beautiful purple ground tapestry here. And you can see the images are laid out decoratively. The birds and the beasts and the flowers become this beautiful pattern. There's not an interest in shading or color blending. That's not the point. However, during the reign of Emperor Huizong, who reigned from 1101 to 1126, we start to see tapestry weave reproduce the visual language of painting. And this tapestry weave itself purports to be a copy of a painting by the famous emperor, Huizong himself, who was a talented painter. All right, as weavers continued to produce compositions that either copied actual paintings or the visual language of paintings, compositions got more complex. The rendering of colors, forms, and even calligraphy got more sophisticated. And so here you can see this beautiful tapestry weaving by a woman weaver, Zhu, active, we think, around the 12th century. And here you can see it, it's compared very easily to this painting by Li Di. So in the Southern Song dynasty, 12th century, we see an interest in small, intimate formats. These are small paintings and tapestries, close-up views of nature, an interest in naturalism, and usually an interest in a composition weighted to one corner. So you can see all of that visual vocabulary of painting being used in the tapestry weave at the time. All right. All right, there are many ways weavers in China have dealt with joining one section of woven colored thread to another in order to create a readable, aesthetically pleasing composition on a continuous piece of fabric. For the weaver, the central challenge is to join blocks of separately woven colors. And scholars use different terms to describe this process. In English, the process is termed color block transition. And usually these four types are referenced: slit tapestry, single and double interlocking, and dovetailing. Slit tapestry is the simplest way to transition between color blocks, right? One color ends wrapped around one warp, the next begins wrapped around the next warp, and you have a slit where the two color blocks meet. Interlocking tapestry interlocks around other wefts, not around the warp threads. And in dovetailing, you have the wefts wrap around the same warp thread. All right, so it is a slit tapestry technique that allows the weaver the most freedom to work with different colors at different times. However, these slits on the surface of the fabric also weaken it, structurally weaken it. And you can see that obviously these structures are stronger. All right, these four categories make tapestry weave easier to understand. But it's interesting to note that Chinese textile scholars use more specific terms. The term color block transition doesn't really exist. This generic term doesn't really exist in Chinese. Chen Zhuanzhuan, who is a scholar, a great textile scholar and former curator at the Beijing Palace Museum, has written about a number of different types of color block transitions and those techniques. And relying on her scholarship, I identify and standardize terms she uses and translate them into English. And then I demonstrate these techniques are used consistently, sometimes over hundreds of years, and therefore can illustrate a visual language of kesi weaving. All right. So because of this new desire to reproduce the visual effects of painting, weavers used new techniques for color blending and joining color blocks. I'm going to introduce a few of these terms. All right, so one technique that began in the Southern Song period, so the 12th century, is called Mucho Tiang, wooden comb technique. And this technique uses horizontal lines that step down in increments to modulate from lighter to darker color, or vice versa. It's called the wooden comb technique because the resultant patterns of light and dark lines look like the teeth of a wooden comb. Evident in this Ming Dynasty kesi fan depicting peonies at the Freer Gallery of Art in DC, this technique also helps to minimize slits on the surface of the fabric while mixing the light and dark colors through thin lines, creating a sense of color blending and giving the viewer a sense of the texture of the peony petal. Similar to wooden comb technique is changduanqiang, long and short technique. You can see instead of forming a regular pattern of combs, teeth, long and short technique creates a more random area of long and short lines of one color that blends into the color block next to it. And blending this time perhaps in a more random, but maybe naturalistic way, this technique creates a resultant boundary between two color blocks that is stronger than a straight line. And this is a detail of right down here on this rock. Another technique for blending colors is canhetiang, which means blended technique. This technique transitions from a block of darker color to light. For example, we can look at this peony here, this central peony petal at this kesi in the Freer Gallery of Art in DC. Through alternating rows of light and dark colors, and here you'll have a stripe of a light color and then maybe 3 rows of a dark, and then you'll alternate sort of 1 each and then have 2 or 3 rows of the light color, creating this wonderful blending. Right, the blended technique is used to dramatic effect when blending colors in the petals of these large peonies. And when viewed up close, you can see the striations. Fengwei Tiang, or phoenix tail technique, is the color blending technique that seems to be the most widely used, which seems unusual, right? It's found most often in Ming and Qing kesi. And so when I say Ming and Qing, the Ming dynasty is 1368 to 1644, the Qing 1644 to 1912. So 14th century through early 20th century. It's a long time. This technique, our phoenix tail technique, appears as a pattern of convex semicircles, like a convex semicircle of a dark color, and then alternating with kind of these striations into the light color, and then a concave semicircle of the dark color, or the light color is now slicing into the dark color block. And then the pattern repeats again, these kind of alternating circles with these striations in between them. Phoenix tail technique is so named because of the feathery texture it gives the line between color blocks, seen here in a detail of butterfly and chrysanthemums at the Musée des Tissus in Lyon. Charmingly, here's an example from Taipei, and you can see phoenix tail technique on the rock again to give it this kind of rocky texture, but you also have phoenixes nearby. So the wonderful phoenix tails remind us of this feathery technique on the rock. All right. Although weaving cannot create the variety of colors possible when mixing pigments in painting, the techniques previously described enable weavers to create a rich variety of pictorial effects. All of the color blending techniques mentioned can be categorized under slit tapestry or dovetailed tapestry. Yet the Chinese terms for different techniques of color blending give the study of kesi a richness and complexity, as well as a vocabulary that can enhance Western scholarship on the subject. While all of the above techniques mentioned have a structural function within the final woven product, there's one technique for color blending in kesi that exists solely within the thread itself. So the name of this technique actually comes from Piao Wenying, who's the curator at the Liaoning Provincial Museum. And she calls this He Hua Xian, which translates directly as joined patterned threads. And I think in English, it makes more sense just as joined threads. The way the weaver did this, she split 2 different color threads into thinner fibers and then twists them together to form a bicolor thread, the exact same thickness as the other silk threads used in the tapestry. And we can see here in Butterfly and Camellia that she uses this technique right on the calyx of the bud. Since the new thread retains both original colors, it doesn't create a blue-green, it gives the area a mottled effect, which is visible right here, here, and also on the calyx of the blossom. When viewed at arm's length, there is a sense of color blending, but when viewing the album leaf more intimately, which one is invited to do simply by the size of the work, the mottled effect is clear to the naked eye. This refined technique creates a sense of texture while still maintaining the smooth surface of the fabric. The technique here creates the appearance of a rougher texture next to the smooth petals of the camellia. All right, and we can see this again also on a calyx of a flower, here the chrysanthemum. All right, and we can see this technique used in a landscape work. Joined threads are used to suggest the texture of wooden beams supporting a palace roof. All right, in the Ming and Qing periods, not only is kesi used to reproduce the visual language of painting, but tapestry weave is used to reproduce works of calligraphy. Weavings that reproduce calligraphers' brushed works represent a luxurious and elite object, which references the importance of scholarship, as well as the highest art form, calligraphy. And this is a kesi copy of a work by Mifu, a really famous Song Dynasty calligrapher and connoisseur. Here is a scroll I've spent some time with the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And this is a hand scroll. You can see it rolled up over here with its beautiful covering. This is the very beginning of it as you unroll it and read it from right to left. This is woven. This is textile woven. This is a hand scroll reproducing a work of calligraphy by the well-known artist and painting theorist Dong Qichang. In this work, and Dong Qichang was living in the working in the 1600s. In the original, which is ink on paper, Dong Qichang actually copied letters by earlier calligraphers. And so this copy of a copy has then been copied in Tapestry Weave in the 18th century at the court of the Emperor Tiang. And there isn't just one copy of this, there's a second one in Shenyang, in the People's Republic of China. So we know there are at least 2 of these tapestry woven hand scrolls. All right. The artisan who wove this work of calligraphy found ways to create subtle effects of ink and paper using only threads. Here we can see the alternating of black and beige thread to create a sense of dry brush. Oh, amazing. At the end of this calligraphy scroll, Dong Qichang impressed 2 red seals that act as another way to sign the work. And the kesi weavers reproduce these seals as faithfully as they do his handwriting. Here, though, with the rectangular regularity of the seal, the weavers incorporate a specific technique. Daswo, or passing bobbins, is a technique that combines dovetailing and slit tapestry. And you can see that 2 bobbins weave separate color blocks next to each other, creating a slit between them. And then at coordinated intervals, each bobbin is wound around a warp thread in the other color block, passing each other just once. The passing of bobbins technique is used simply to create clear break between colors while keeping the structure of the fabric intact. And we can see it used along the top of the seal here. And right here, the bobbins have each kind of passed each other. All right. All right. Pictorial kesi had many uses in the Ming and Qing dynasties. Artisans produced pictorial tapestry weaves that held auspicious meanings for the viewer. For example, these 2 works with their images of peaches reference immortality because the fruit was associated with Taoists and immortals. Therefore, kesi such as these 2 might have served as luxurious birthday gifts for someone. And interestingly, here's another example. It's not quite as pretty, but a line from a poem, and this is also woven into this work, discusses the buildup of threads as similar to the years of one's life. So in this poem, one thread, then another, accumulating to symbolize hundreds of thousands of years of longevity. End quote. Makes not only the visual subject matter of the peach appropriate as a birthday present, but the medium of tapestry woven object itself referential to one's longevity. Tapestry weave continues to be used for utilitarian purposes, such as these 18th century chair strips. Chair strips were tied onto traditional wooden furniture to add a decorative touch, as well as an element of comfort. And now that the potential for tapestry weave to incorporate painting-like imagery was known and developed, we find small painting-like moments on decorative works for furnishings. Here, a scene of a garden rock with peonies and other flowers decorate a section of each chair strip. We can see the use of a blending technique in the peony petals and the rock. However, for a colorful decorative furniture cover, we do not see the same attention to detail that we see used in kesi works meant to function like paintings. Some imperial dragon robes were made from tapestry weave. The clear breaks between color blocks, creating a beautiful and dramatic robe with a smooth surface. However, even on this robe, which is about legibility of the dragon, right, the symbol of the emperor and his power, we can see the use of color blending techniques on the dragon's tongue. And that's this little dragon down here, but most of them have this brilliant moment of red on the end of the tongue, giving a contrast within this small element of the robe. So in weaving pictorial tapestry, the weaver references the visual language of painting. This process requires multiple departures from techniques of weaving other kinds of textiles. while the painter blends and mixes colors, adding darker hues or ink to give a sense of shading or shadow, the weaver achieves these effects only through the manipulation of colored threads. Ming, this scholar, contemporary scholar, makes an analogy between the painter's materials and those of the weaver. Quote, "The warp threads act as the paper, the bobbins are the brushes, and the colored threads are the ink and colors," end quote. This beautiful analogy recalls a 16th century painter's comment on this particular weaving right here. He states of the weaver, quote, "Her skill is so extraordinary, she handled the silk as if handling a brush," end quote. Again and again, pictorial kesi are likened to paintings, yet the technique of weaving a picture is completely different. Instead of handling threads and bobbins as brushes, weavers invented ways to join and blend color blocks that added texture and shading to an image, weaving so adeptly that viewers could not help but liken a woven object to one produced with brush and ink. Understanding how a kesi was produced illuminates the choices weavers made in order to create images that resembled paintings. Kesi weavers not only developed color blending techniques specific to tapestry weaving in China, they standardized them and continued to use specific color blending techniques for specific motifs, such as phoenix tail technique for creating texture on rocks. And here we see it on mountains, these back mountains. When we look closely at kesi, we can identify these distinct color blending techniques or variations on them in many works produced from the 12th through the 19th centuries, right? Almost 700 years. Again and again, we see the same techniques used for the same subject matter. Peony petals are almost always woven with a version of wooden comb technique. Rocks and objects with rounded textures are often depicted with shading done in phoenix tail technique. Acknowledging these techniques and how they've been developed and used consistently gives us a window into a world that has been otherwise closed to scholars. We have very few texts about weaving practices, yet the objects themselves show us techniques that have been taught, learned, manipulated, and incorporated as a kesi repertoire, passed down from master to apprentice. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
No, thank you so much, Alexandra. It was really mesmerizing, like visual poetry. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all.